In this second video of the overview of Psalms, we'll begin by looking at the issues of authorship. Here are several Psalms that can give us an idea regarding the various authors that contributed to the book of Psalms. Please pause the video at this point and scan these briefly, extracting whatever information you can concerning the authors. As we look these over, we see that some, as observed earlier, are attributed to David, and there are 73 in number, which match this description. We've already talked about Psalm 18 with its parallel appearance in 2 Samuel 22. Largely, we derive this information from the superscriptions. Sometimes they will go so far as not only to name David, but also describe some of the episodes in his own life with which it's thought that a given psalm may correspond. There are 14 of these where the superscription tells something of a story from David's life. One example occurs in Psalm 34, and we're told there that it was on the occasion of him fleeing from Abimelech, a neighboring king, that he wrote that psalm. And we've already referred to Psalm 51, which is connected with his contrition following the adulterous affair with Bathsheba. You might wonder, when did these superscriptions appear? Well, let's put it this way. We hold no ancient manuscript, whether Hebrew or Greek, which would have been the first ancient language into which it was translated. We hold no manuscripts which omit these superscriptions. So, as far as we know, they're original, or at least very, very early. Davidic poems comprise one source of information regarding authorship. Another is the attribution to Levitical choirs. On the one hand, this could be sons of Korah, or alternatively, an individual employed in this role, musical associated with the Levites, and that would be Asaph. Let's take a look at a couple of examples so that we can visualize this. Here is Psalm 42, opening what's known as Book 2, that is, the next collection following the benediction that closed Psalm 41. Notice in the superscription the designation to the leader, a maskil, that is an instructional style of poem, of the Korahites. And this gives us our designation that it may have been the people of Korah who were involved in serving as Levitical choir, who actually were the composers for this poem. Several of the psalms following 42 are also attributed to the sons of Korah. And here you see the superscription for Psalm 50, designating Asaph as the composer of this. As with the Davidic Psalms, we should acknowledge that the Hebrew expression is the same. That is, it could be translated either to Asaph, for Asaph, or by Asaph. There are 12 Psalms that are attributed to the sons of Korah, and another 12 to Asaph. We should note that in the Psalms listed for sons of Korah, 42 to 49, 43 does not have the Korah designation. It is thought by some to actually be a continuation of Psalm 42. With the previous two Davidic poems and Levitical choirs, we've accounted for the first three on our initial list: Psalm 18, Psalm 42, Psalm 50, and now we come to Psalm 72, which together with 127, you may have discovered, is attributed to Solomon. We don't generally think of Solomon as among the poets of the book of Psalms. We've mentioned sons of Korah already. Heman in particular is mentioned in conjunction with Psalm 88. Ethan, or Etan, Psalm 89, and even Moses is credited as having been author of one of the Psalms, Psalm 90. Now there are some Psalms which have no designation of an author. These have come to be known as orphan Psalms, and there are 49 of them. Perhaps you're wondering about this Levitical choir. What do we know about them? The following diagram may shed some light on this question. In 1 Chronicles 6, from verse 31 and following, we learn about some of these Levitical choir members. Here's the general scheme. We know that Merari, Kohath, and Gershon were 3 sons of Levi. Incidentally, the clan of Kohath, descendant of Levi, included Moses, Aaron, and Korah. So when we're speaking about sons of Korah, it is about this descendant of Levi through his son Kohath. At the lower level, you see from the left in yellow the names Ethan, Heman, and Asaph. Again, we're indebted to the 1 Chronicles 6 passage, which indicates the positioning of these 3 contemporaries as they served. Ethan on the left, Heman centered, and Asaph on his right. These were appointed by David specifically for the purpose of providing liturgical or sanctuary music. And it is those names in bold, Ethan, Heman, and Asaph, which we find named in superscriptions for the various psalms that we've noted a bit earlier. Now we're going to turn our attention to the historical context. And I'd like to ask you to pause the video for a bit. Take a look at Psalm 18, one we've seen earlier, but also Psalm 126 and 137. We've also visited this one earlier, an imprecatory psalm. And ask yourself the question, what information can we derive regarding the era in the history of Israel when this was composed? Take a moment and examine these, please. Did you notice that the Davidic era is quite clearly apparent from psalms such as Psalm 18? Now when we come to Psalm 137, the third in this list, our attention historically is directed to a period after 605 BC. Reason for this is the mention of Babylon and the indication that the author is himself or herself a captive. So we're dealing with the exilic era. Incidentally, there was an earlier exile. The conquest of the northern Israel by the Assyrians caused a dispersion of northern Israelites spread across parts of the Assyrian kingdom. That would not have created mention of the rivers of Babylon, however. Perhaps it would have created a mention of something like the Assyrian capital, Nineveh. But since this name's Babylon, that puts us into the second exile period, that of southern Israel, Judah. And Judah fell in 587. The capital, Jerusalem, fell at that point, 587 BC. But the first exile took place at 605. So this would be our first period within which Psalm 137 would have been at home. 605 was the first deportation, we should say, beginning the exilic period. That marked the deportation, for example, of Daniel. When we come to Psalm 126, the second in the list above, we find mention of the Lord bringing back the captives. And this would then fit with the era that we know as the post-exilic era, when, thanks to the edict of Cyrus the Persian, Israelites were authorized to leave their place in exile in the Persian kingdom, make their way back to Israel if they so desired. The prophetic books of Haggai and Zechariah belong to this era, encouraging the returning Israelites to rebuild the temple. Much later, Nehemiah belongs to the post-exilic era, where he encourages the people to build a wall around Jerusalem. So we observe from this selective scanning of these three Psalms right away that there is a broad range of Israelite history represented in the Psalms. Now, granted, there are many Psalms for which we have no historic anchor point. We simply know that somehow they belong to the Israelite period before the books of the Hebrew Bible were congealed into one group. What about that very feature, the congealing of the books of the Hebrew Bible into one group? Well, when it comes to the Psalms, the collection as a whole is known from the 2nd century BC, and it's Ben Sira who mentions that the Psalms are a known collection at that time. We will direct our attention now turning from historical context to literary context. Here are 3 Psalms that display some characteristic literary devices. I wonder if you'd pause the video for a bit, take a look at these, and see if you can detect what devices are at work. In the case of Psalm 8, we find that the opening line and the closing line are the same. O Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth. When an opening and closing are the same, this is known as closure or inclusio. As to the effect, it brings a finishing feel to the close of the poem, returning you to the point of origin. And certainly there's a degree of emphasis saying whatever was the content of those opening and closing lines, it must have been something of importance to the composer. In the case of Psalm 136, we find the use of refrain. This is the psalm which in the second portion of every verse affirms the steadfast love of the Lord lasts forever. In Psalm 119, if your English version indicates the Hebrew alphabet that occupies successive groups of 8 verses, then you would know that this operates with an alphabetic acrostic. Here, for example, in the New International Version, we find that the editors have supplied this information. So you notice the Aleph designation prior to verse 1. This lets us know that the 8 verses, 1 through 8, each will begin so that the first letter of the first word of each verse begins with Aleph. Similarly, when we come to verse 9, the next 8 verses, each verse begins with the letter Beit, the second letter of the Hebrew alphabet. Even without knowing Hebrew, you can see that fact by scanning the initial letters here. So you see verse 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8 all begin with the letter Aleph. And now a new letter begins in verse 9, the letter Beit, and that continues through verse 16. And then 17 and following, the next 8, will use the third letter of the Hebrew alphabet, Gimel. Other literary devices that frequently are encountered in the Book of Psalms, representative of Hebrew poetry, include parallelism, and this is where 2 adjacent phrases, typically within the same verse, have a similar content. That would be synonymous parallelism. Here's a sample of synonymous parallelism from the first verse of Psalm 6. Notice how verse 1a and 1b are quite similar. O Lord, do not rebuke me in your anger, or discipline me in your wrath. Rebuke is parallel to the verb discipline. Anger is parallel to the noun wrath. Basically, it seems to be saying the same thing twice. There is a secret, however, in taking advantage of this literary device of synonymous parallelism, and it is this. Routinely, we find that whatever is the second, that is the ditto expression, routinely this intensifies whatever was the concept in part A of the verse. So typically we will find vocabulary in part B that is a little more rare or specialized, vivid or active or sharp. They're in line B. So be on the lookout for that. It's not simply a monotonous space filler in part B, but rather the author is becoming more intense, more precise, and in often cases more energetic in line B. That's synonymous parallelism. There are other kinds of parallelism that you can read about in introductions to Hebrew poetry or introductions to the Psalms. Another literary device that we frequently encounter in Hebrew poetry is the use of figurative language. Think, for example, in Psalm 23, "The Lord is my shepherd." We know he's not literally a shepherd, but the figure of speech, particularly here a metaphor equating God with the role of a shepherd, illuminates the abstract, the concept of what is God's character like, and makes it more concrete. Typically, this is the gift, that is the effect achieved by figurative language. It endeavors to render concrete something which otherwise would remain abstract. Here's another, when God is typified as a fortress. God is not literally a fortress, but the abstract characteristics of God then become more visible. We can visualize them, we can appreciate them when someone says, God amounts to a fortress. And then all the traits of a fortress, we can take them and convert them as is appropriate, apply them, recognize them as part of God's character. Have you ever noticed some of the terms associated with the Hebrew Psalms, such as Selah, or Mizmor, or Maskil, Shir, or Shigayon, and wondered what these are? This is what scholars feel is designated by these various terms. Selah, a meditative pause. It occurs quite a few times at the end of a line. Some have considered it to be a musical interlude. Perhaps that is what took place. Mizmor, and this will typically appear in the superscription, not like Selah, interspersed right within the psalm, but in the superscription, if we encounter Mizmor, then we know that this particular composition qualified in the ancient categorization as a psalm, particularly a psalm that might be accompanied by a stringed instrument. When we encounter in a superscription the designation maskil, we should understand that the composition was somehow instructional. Take, for example, Psalm 78, which recounts parts of Israel's history, instructing in the light of what has gone on before, the experiences corporately undergone by the people of Israel. Sometimes you will find the notation shir. Shir simply means a song. Shigayon, on the other hand, designates a dirge, that is a particularly mournful expression of lament. We'll turn our attention now from things such as historical context, literary context, that is poetic devices, and ask, what do we know about how psalms were used in the life of ancient Israel? One of the avenues of inquiry concerning ancient usage is known as form criticism, or in its German expression, Formgeschichte. When we engage in form criticism, this line of inquiry seeks to identify what was the religious life setting or the situation in the community. In German, this is known as the Sitz im Leben, for each poem. A German scholar by the name of Hermann Gunkel was influential in pioneering the Formgeschichte, the form critical lens of viewing psalms. So here are some of the settings within which we imagine psalms being used in the ancient life, that is, in the life of ancient Israel. First, times when the community at large in a corporate experience was engaged in worship. Some of these might have been used on daily situations, others on monthly occasions, such as the New Moon Festival, for worship that was taking place at the temple in Jerusalem. We've mentioned already that there were annual festivals, particularly the Big Three, where attendance for men was mandatory at Jerusalem. And so we can understand that psalms such as the Songs of Ascent would have been used at this time of the year. That would have been the setting in life, the Sitzim Leben, when these psalms would have come to life and been employed. And once again, you find these as the three mandatory festivals. Festival of Tabernacles we earlier designated as the Festival of Booths, or the Festival of Shelters. Pilgrimage, the Songs of Ascents, as we've talked about, refers to the pilgrimage singing. Other corporate occasions for particular songs, it's thought that at the coronation of the king, a psalm like number 2 or number 101 might have been used. If you wish, you may pause and take a look at the content and see that these have to do with enthronement of a monarch. Part of Psalm 18 or 68 could have been used as celebration when a battle proved to be successful. Or Psalm 44 could have been used when the nation was undergoing a time of disaster. Notice the potentiality of this. We do not have record of a particular psalm actually being used in a historical recollection. That is to say, we do not know when Hannah and Elkanah and Peninnah, I'm thinking of 1 Samuel chapter 1, and they would go, we're told, to Jerusalem at festival time. Right there we have a situation, a historically recorded situation in the life of ancient Israel. But we have no mention of what psalms might they have sung as they traveled along. Consequently, all of this discussion about form criticism and situation in life is highly hypothetical. It doesn't mean it's useless. We just want to be candid about the degree of certitude or lack thereof which we have in these speculations. You see on the screen before you finally then private worship settings, whether of thanksgiving, Psalm 30, or of petition, Psalm 6. Here we have Psalm 30. Notice that it is individual, and it is expressing gratitude. I will extol you, O Lord, for you have drawn me up, and did not let my foes rejoice over me. In the case of Psalm 6, it appears as an individual petition. O Lord, do not rebuke me in your anger, or discipline me in your wrath. So it is that we imagine psalms such as 30 and 6 as being used more in an individual or private worship setting. We'll close by considering the message of the Psalms. It's helpful to consider that the Psalms, by their very content and the fact that someone stopped to record them, they take spirituality in the life of that ancient pilgrim, and for ourselves as we appropriate it, they take spirituality a step beyond static narrative obedience. Here's what we have in mind by static narrative obedience. If we have a story, perhaps in the life of Samuel, where God tells him to do something, and wonderfully we learn that he did it, that sort of narrative account of obedience is helpful. We know that there was an individual in the history of Israel who walked with God and serves as an example for us to respond with obedience. But what was Samuel thinking when that went on? What may have been his dialogue with God? Actually, come to think of it, sometimes we do know what Samuel said to God in response to some of God's directions. Sometimes he was concerned about the commands that God was giving him, particularly when he was on the outs, or that we should say when Saul was on the outs with God. That raised concern with Samuel. But there are situations when we have a narrative account of someone's response and interaction with God's commands, and we don't know what's going on the inside. With the Psalms, it is very much an interior witness to what is going on in the life of this individual. Now, admittedly, with many of them we don't know what was the historical context. We only know the interior, but even in that regard, it is a considerable gift. Second, let's realize that many, not all, but many of the Psalms really are prayers. These are conversations with the divine. And where there is conversation with God, this indicates a relationship. In this regard, then, Psalms is all about relationships. It's all about communication. And the sort of dimension that should characterize the life of a follower of the Messiah is one in relationship with him, not simply one who picks up assignment sheets out of a box and then does what's told on it. And would it not be true, thirdly, that the fact that this recollection and description of relationships, this spirituality described in an interior fashion, a step beyond static obedience, the fact that it takes on the form of poetic composition seems to me it may indicate that there is reflection going on regarding that relationship. I don't know if you've ever tried to write poetry. Most of us either have been assigned to do so at some point in our education, or perhaps we like to do so. Whichever is the case, good poetry composition doesn't happen typically just on a whim. Generally, there's initially a period of reflection when someone thinks about what they're going to say, and oftentimes there's conscious polishing when a first draft doesn't quite capture the sentiment that we find within us. So, by virtue of Psalms being poetic, we are introduced to a level of reflection that the pilgrim is engaged in, reflection regarding that relationship. This is a thoughtful relationship. No doubt you could add other messages of the Psalms. We could think back on the gift that the imprecatory Psalms, in all their roughness and jaggedness, give to us, and the strength of the Psalms that offer testimonies of God's deliverance and how encouraging these are to us, multiple messages. But these three at least give us a starter, a beginning point as we reflect on the gift which the Psalms are to us.